One of these days, I'm hoping to write a whole book about Robert Anton Wilson on magic. Reading Cosmic Trigger in college basically transformed me into a magical researcher and practitioner. And the academic world has shamefully neglected old Bob's importance and influence in this regard. But I had a terrible time in grad school, and I don't think the academic world is the best place to actually accomplish such a project. So I'm going the independent scholar route, and it's going to be a while before I have the chops and the time. It came as a great relief that Eric Davis has blazed the trail by doing a PhD on Robert Anton Wilson, Philip K. Dick, and Terence McKenna, and it occurred to me recently that I might narrow the scope of my project to talk about one dimension of the magical tradition which informed these guys, what we call Hermeticism. In the academic world, Hermeticism as a topic finally gained respectability in a large degree due to the work of Francis Yates, who it turns out all three of my guys read. In this note, I'm going to lay out a few of my findings on how Yates's concept of Hermeticism was an influence and pitch y'all on where I'd like to see further research directed. All three had an arguably decisive encounter with the so-called Hermetic tradition, and as we will see, they each took that illumination in different directions. Bob Wilson drops the name of Francis Yates, spelled Francis, in the Cosmic Trigger. On page 131 of the new Falcon edition, we read, "In our last meeting at Vacaville Prison, I told Tim Leary, Giordano Bruno is the first philosopher in history to suggest that there were higher intelligences in this galaxy. Used tantric yoga." It looks like I have a typo here. "Yeah, I know," he said. "Oh, I asked you've read Francis Yates's Giordano Bruno in the Hermetic tradition?" "No," he said. "It was obvious from Bruno's own writings. Sex magic is always the first of the secrets." From the misspelling of her name, we might infer, and Tom Jackson has disagreed with me on this. He thinks that Wilson was likely a close reader of Yates. The trouble is, where do we find any place that he's actually using her work? That Wilson wasn't too deep a reader of Yates, and his characterization of Bruno is pretty far from the character we encounter in her controversial pioneering study. I don't remember reading any claims in Yates about higher intelligence or tantric yoga. However, as I'll get to in a moment, no less an authority than the eminent Chicago School historian of magic, Ioan Culianu, forgive me if I mispronounce his name, has addressed the possibility that Bruno was referring to sexual magic. But Yates's Bruno and her Hermetic tradition does resonate with Wilson's ideas in a number of ways. Yates theorized that the Hermetic tradition played more of a role in the history of science than has hitherto acknowledged in scholarship, Wilson, in a similar fashion, was trying to recover a secret tradition of Hermeticism, most successfully, in my humble opinion, in his historical Illuminatus novels. This is indeed how I was sold on the idea of devoting my intellectual career to the recovery of early modern magic. Culianu, whose life ended in a bizarre, honest-to-God assassination plot full of absurdity and worthy of a Wilson novel, see the book by Ted Anton, discussed the quote-unquote erotic magic of Bruno, as well as other big names of Renaissance magic, such as Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, in his classic study Eros and Magic in the Renaissance. But Culianu concludes that Bruno was not hinting at a specific practice of tantric sex magic as Leary surmised. According to Culianu, one might think, based on Bruno's writing, that the practice of coitus reservatus was not foreign to Bruno's magic, page 99. Although he acknowledges that Bruno spoke very briefly and left a lot of room for interpretation, Culianu concludes that what Bruno wishes to say has no connection with the practices of coitus reservatus. He simply recommends that the manipulator be continent at the same time ardly desire the subject, page 101. Bruno was interested in Culianu's view in a more general theory of how desire and seduction play a role in the universal bonds that the master of magic manipulates. And in Bruno's De Vinculis we read, ejaculation of semen releases the bonds, whereas its retention strengthens them. He who wishes to enchain is obliged to develop the same emotions as he who must be bound. This is why when we are overheated at banquets or after banquets, Cupid invades us. Quoted on Culiano, page 100. Wilson is not so circumspect as Culiano, not writing for the censorious gatekeepers of academia. As many in academia in today's world, I have a big typo in my typescript here, will allow of a revived interest in esotericism after a few drinks. Wilson was not wrong to point out that magical traditions were flying under the radar of the Inquisition. Sorry, I still don't have that right. So, as many an academic in today's world of a revived interest in esotericism will allow after a few drinks. Oh, I did have that right. Wilson was not wrong to point out that magical traditions were flying under the radar of the Inquisition, and perhaps being kept secret for other reasons. So it is very difficult to rule out magical practice being behind the miles and miles of pages of magical theory produced in the Renaissance by these careful esoterics. Frances Yates herself has a bad rap among the more serious academics because she jumped to the kind of wild conclusions that Wilson and Leary often found obvious. And although in public scholars of magic have to say that she has been superseded, many will allow, if you catch them at the right party, that Yates was right to look for a hidden Hermetic tradition beyond what scrupulous historical scholarship can prove. Without getting too much further tangled into the weeds of historiography, I think that Wilson will be vindicated in a similar fashion. He was stoned out of his gourd and made a few mistakes as an interpreter of Renaissance magic, but he was also brilliant and original in discovering so many useful things about it. The Hermetic tradition becomes a key to the cosmic trigger. Quote, "It occurred to me that I finally had the secret of the Illuminati. They were not the fantasy of right-wing paranoids. The Illuminati was one of the names of an underground mystical movement using sexual yoga in the Western world. The veils of obscurity and mystery around such figures such as Giordano Bruno, John Dee, Cagliostro, the original Rosicrucians of the 17th century, Crowley himself, and various other key figures in the conspiracy had nothing to do with politics or plots to take over the world. It was a screen to protect them from persecution by the Holy Inquisition and in earlier centuries and from puritanical policemen in our time." That's the Cosmic Trigger, page 70. Along with Frances Yates, I think the argument can be made that Wilson played a huge role in the creation of our contemporary concept of what Hermetic magic, quote-unquote, even means. And he pulled that off by showing how the magic worked, just as Yates pulled off her scholarly coup by pointing out why magic is interesting to historians of ideas. Wilson modeled for us how to be a Hermetic practitioner, and whether or not he gets the history right, we can't deny that the practices he digs up are working for us and on us as we read his books. Wilson engaged with many thinkers, but I think Eric Davis was onto something when he decided to write his Weird Studies PhD on Wilson and his colleagues, Terence McKenna and Philip K. Dick. And I can say that reading about McKenna and Dick in Wilson's books were key moments in setting me on my own path. Understanding what Wilson saw in their projects can go a long way toward explaining what the guy was doing with magic. And it turns out that the Hermeticism, specifically of Frances Yates, played an important role for both thinkers, although this hasn't received nearly enough attention. I'm not going to go so far as to say I'm confident this information is going to blow your minds, but I hope I've made a case for taking a more serious look. McKenna gave a workshop on Frances Yates, and he had a bunch of heads read Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition by Yates. We've got hours and hours of recordings of the talks he gave. This is an article about Wilson, so I'll just give a quick sketch and leave you to go do your own digging. What I believe was key to McKenna was the concept of the, quote, Rosicrucian Enlightenment, unquote, in Yates, which is the title of her next most important book, which McKenna used as a metaphor for the kind of psychedelic community he wanted to see come into being. My favorite moment in the talks is when McKenna speculates about Rene Descartes running through the alchemist Michael Meyer during an invasion which found these 17th century thinkers on other sides, and after which Meyer was never heard from again. This is a literalizing of the figurative, Descartes representing the mechanistic and rationalistic worldview that destroyed the more holistic and vitalistic alchemical worldview of Michael Meyer. Culiano wrote of an Renaissance culture, that's in Eros and Magic and the Renaissance again, of the phantasmic being annihilated by the Renaissance culture of the phantasmic being annihilated by the Protestant ethic of iconoclasm and grim work. The conspiracy stole all the slack, to put it in a more modern idiom. Culture is not your friend, according to McKenna, and like Wilson on the New Inquisition, McKenna worked to recover the magic that is still possible despite our disenchanted modern worldview. This moment of the Rosicrucian Enlightenment changed the course of culture, but we can still go back and see what avenues remained before the cataclysm of disenchantment. Phil Dick was onto this as well, but it terrified him. He wrote in his 9,000-page exegesis that he was afraid he had destroyed Christianity by discovering the secret magical tradition. In his last novels, the Valis trilogy, the Hermetic tradition plays an important role, especially in the first book, Valis, in which Giordano Bruno and the quote-unquote Hermetic alchemists, see the appendix Tractatus Crypticus Scriptura, are part of the backstory, having been a secret tradition that searched for the entity made of information throughout the history of magic. Dick experimented with Rosicrucian practices that he obtained by responding to the AMORC ads in pulps, and gives detailed accounts of his visionary experiences. One time he had a quote-unquote Kabbalistic vision of numbers transforming into letters and some kind of a visual demonstration of the Logos, which was also an important idea to McKenna, who said that reality is made out of code. At this point, I get to make like PKD and inject myself as a character into my own story, reading Valis and wondering about where Dick got the idea of these Hermetic alchemists, which I think he's doing a brilliant and original job of science fictionalizing, prodded me to wonder whether Dick had read Yates. The other important book of Francis Yates, The Art of Memory, plays a key role here. Yates saw that Giordano Bruno built his magic on the classical ancient Greek art of memory, memorizing a speech by visualizing a palace, walking through in your head and associating the lines of the speech with the different rooms and their contents, which was in turn used by medieval monks for spiritual purposes. The magician is able to have a vision of the divine because he imprints the entire universe into his art of memory, which might be vaguely familiar to readers of Philip K. Dick's Valis. This is an article about Wilson, though, so I'm not going to spoil it. Long story short, I thought this must be due to the influence of Yates, but I hadn't yet found the smoking gun, which came from Eric Davis, who, after hearing an early version of all this, emailed Pamela Jackson. By an early vision of all this, I mean all of my speculation on Dick and Yates, editor of the exegesis and the only human who at this point had read the whole damn exegesis twice. That's 9,000 pages. Turns out she had spotted a mention of Dick borrowing the Rosicrucian Enlightenment from a friend, I'm guessing K.W. Jeter. Somebody should probably ask him about it, but I've been hesitant to bug him or Tim Powers about it, as I hear he's tired of being asked about Dick's weird religious crap. So what is the takeaway from all this? Each of these guys had an encounter with the Hermetic tradition, which I'm prepared to argue was formative on their projects and influential on the reception of Hermeticism in the larger awe culture. It occurs to me right now to mention the book by Peter Levenda on Thomas and Rebecca Vaughan being that their alchemical work was all just an allegory for sexual magic, an idea that gets criticized by William R. Newman in a great article in an Alan Debus anthology. If anybody's interested in this alchemy stuff, I'm happy to give you more references. So influential on the reception of Hermeticism in the larger awe culture. What needs to happen next is a more careful study of what they were reading and how they interpreted it, as well as how they put this inspiration into practice through their work and creativity. Not to mention whatever esoteric visionary practices and experiences we can ascribe to them. What are they doing with the Hermetic tradition in their books and talks? How did they revive or transform the magic? Wilson's recovery of the Hermetic tradition was heavily informed by his interest in Aleister Crowley, who I'll note in passing made the alchemist Michael Meyer a Thelemic saint, and the Golden Dawn tradition, right? They called it the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, whereas McKenna and Dick were digging further back into the early modern magical thinkers and their ancient sources. There's a great moment where Dick worries, have I destroyed Christianity by going back to this ancient magic? But the influence of Hermeticism on the work of these three guys is just the tip of the iceberg when we turn to consider their influence on the occulture that would flower in the generations coming after them. Dick's popularization of Gnosticism is just starting to get some academic press. See, for example, the excellent scholarly anthology, The Gnostic World, in which he makes it onto a page or two on contemporary Gnosticism. But Wilson's popularization of Hermeticism is worthy of at least a few PhD dissertations, perhaps at the Amsterdam School of Western Esotericism or at Jeff Kripal's conclave in Houston. Thanks for listening to my paper.